In the early hours of June 28, 1969, something extraordinary happened in New York City. A police raid on a small, unassuming bar in Greenwich Village ignited an uprising that would change the course of history. That bar was the Stonewall Inn. And what began as a routine raid quickly turned into a defiant stand against decades of oppression. Outside the bar, a crowd of over 500 people gathered, refusing to back down. For too long, LGBTQ individuals had been forced to live in the shadows, criminalized, harassed, and denied their humanity. But on this night, something shifted. The Stonewall Uprising didn't happen in a vacuum. Its roots were planted long before that fateful night. After World War II, America was desperate to restore a rigid social order. The fear of communism fueled a wave of suspicion and repression, targeting anyone who didn't fit the mold of what was considered American. Among those persecuted were gay men and lesbians, labeled as security risks by the US government. By 1950, a Senate investigation led by Clyde Hoey declared homosexuals emotionally and mentally unstable and unfit for government service. The consequences were devastating. Thousands of people lost their jobs, were discharged from the military, or were publicly outed, leading to social ostracism. Between 1947 and 1950 alone, 1,700 federal job applications were denied. 4,380 people were discharged from the military, and 420 were fired from government jobs, all for being suspected homosexuals. The oppression didn't stop there. The FBI and local police departments kept lists of known homosexuals, their friends, and the establishments they frequented. The US Post Office tracked addresses where LGBTQ-related materials were mailed. Cities conducted sweeps to rid neighborhoods, parks, and beaches of gay people. Universities expelled instructors suspected of being homosexual. Bars that served LGBTQ patrons were frequent targets of police raids. Patrons were arrested, humiliated, and often had their names published in newspapers, ruining their lives. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association classified homosexuality as a mental disorder, justifying inhumane treatments like electroshock therapy, aversion therapy, and even lobotomies. But even in the face of relentless persecution, resistance began to take shape. In the 1950s, the first LGBTQ+ advocacy groups emerged. The Mattachine Society, founded in Los Angeles in 1950 by activist Harry Hay, sought to unify homosexuals, educate them, and assist those facing legal troubles. However, under intense opposition, the group shifted its focus in 1953 to assimilation and respectability, believing they could change public opinion by proving that gay men and lesbians were normal and no different from heterosexuals. Around the same time, a group of women in San Francisco formed the Daughters of Bilitis, DOB, the first lesbian civil rights organization in the US. Initially created as a safe space for lesbians to socialize, the DOB soon adopted similar goals to the Mattachine Society, urging members to assimilate into mainstream society. Both organizations emphasize cautious activism, avoiding confrontation, and focusing on education and legal reforms. By 1953, the organization O&E, Incorporated, published a magazine called O&E, which became the first pro-gay publication to win a Supreme Court case. After the US Postal Service refused to mail an issue of the magazine, claiming it was obscene, the court ruled in 1958 that O&E could be distributed. It was a small but significant victory for LGBTQ rights. By the 1960s, the movement was growing bolder. Activists like Frank Kameny, a former government employee fired for being gay, fought tirelessly against the classification of homosexuality as a mental disorder. Kameny famously declared, "We are no longer going to ask for our rights. We are going to take them." The 1960s were a time of social upheaval in the United States. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and opposition to the Vietnam War inspired LGBTQ activists to adopt more confrontational tactics. In 1965, news of Cuban prison work camps for homosexuals spurred protests at the United Nations and the White House. Organized by the Mattachine Society, these pickets shocked many in the LGBT community, as public demonstrations were seen as risky and radical at the time. On this fateful warm summer night in New York City, June 27, 1969, inside the Stonewall Inn, the dance floor was alive with joy and electric. But at 1:20 a.m., the music stopped. The lights came on. 8 plainclothes officers and 2 uniformed cops stormed inside. Patrons were lined up, their IDs checked. Transgender women and gender non-conforming individuals were subjected to humiliating gender checks. Outside, tensions began to boil over. A butch lesbian, believed to be Storm DeLavery, fought back, shouting to the crowd, "Why don't you do something?" And that was the spark. At first, there was silence. Then, a bottle was thrown. Another. Bricks. Coins. Trash. The crowd swelled to hundreds. Then thousands. Overwhelmed by the fury, the police retreated inside the Stonewall Inn, barricading themselves. Protesters tore a parking meter from the ground and used it as a battering ram. A Molotov cocktail ignited part of the building. Riot police arrived, charging with batons, but the crowd stood firm, taunting their oppressors with chants and even forming a kickline. "We are the Stonewall Girls. We wear our hair in curls." By 4:00 a.m., the streets were cleared, but the fight was far from over. The next night, thousands returned to the streets, chanting gay power, and "We shall overcome." For 6 days, protests and demonstrations continued. New organizations like the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activists Alliance emerged, rejecting the cautious activism of the past. The movement had transformed, no longer asking for acceptance but demanding liberation. 1 year later, on June 28, 1970, the first Pride March took place in New York City. Thousands marched, commemorating the Stonewall Riots and how it ignited a global movement. In 1973, homosexuality was declassified as a mental disorder. In 2003, sodomy laws in the US were struck down. In 2015, same-sex marriage was legalized nationwide. In 2016, the Stonewall Inn was declared a national monument. As we know, the fight is far from over. Around the world, LGBTQ rights remain under threat and discrimination persists. But the Stonewall Riots remind us of the power of resistance, the strength of community, and the importance of standing up for what is right. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Together, we can keep these stories alive.